Thank everybody for thank you for doing that there, Andrew. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Lucien Cloutier. I am a municipal government advisor for Alberta Municipal Affairs. This session is split up into two parts. I'll do the first part, and then my colleague over in Justice, Tammy, who's just waving right now, she will do her part. And I wonder if you could provide a bit of an introduction for us.
Sure. I'm Tammy Spink. I'm the manager of law enforcement oversight and standards programs. So that covers things like the peace officer program, policing standards and audits. We deal with the actual enforcement side of automated traffic enforcement. So there's a number of programs that we administer at our end, the peace officer program being my primary responsibility. We're not with Justice anymore because they split us up. So now we're public safety and emergency services, and Justice has its own little thing going on over there. But give us a couple of years, we'll be back together again because it happens that way, right? So it's great to be here with everybody this morning. I look forward to hearing everybody's questions and going through the chat.
We also have the ever-talented Andrew Wood, who's helping us with the technical aspects of things, and he will also be looking at tracking questions. We're going to talk a little bit more about that there. I don't know if Andrew, if you want to introduce yourself or not.
Hello, everyone. Andrew Wood here. I'm also a municipal advisor with the Department of Municipal Affairs. And yeah, like my colleague said, I'll just be helping out with some of the technical aspects as we go along.
All right, before I proceed with anything else, I'd like to start off with the land acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation. I'd like to acknowledge that Alberta includes the traditional territory of the signatories to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and also acknowledge the Métis people of Alberta who have a deep connection with this land. So having said that, now what I was going to call this session, but because of the recent change in the rejiggering of the departments, I can't call this the PB&J session anymore. It was going to be policies, bylaws, and justice. But just for this once, we'll still call it the PB&J session. And we're going to try to sandwich in as much as we can for the next 90 minutes. I'll start by doing the first 45 minutes. It may run a little over. I'm going to try to be brief. And for that reason, I'm not really going to be able to take your questions on the go. What we'll do is I'll do my bit, Tammy will do her bit, and then depending on how time is, we'll try to address questions at the end. If we there it was, gone. If we don't get to the questions, I will try to find a way to get you the answers to the questions. Otherwise, I will talk to Wendy Peters, our person who set this all up here, and I'm sure through mystical and borderline divine ways, she'll have some way of us doing that. So, disclaimer, this is not legal advice. We attempt to present you information that's as accurate as possible, but it's provided as general information only. And I don't really know general information well, but I know him enough to know that that's what he is general information. You should consider consulting with your municipal lawyers when crafting bylaws and policies for assurance that they meet legal standards. And they advise me that my check's in the mail for saying that. I mean, I really think it's a good idea if you check legal counsel if you need to find things out there. Yes, there you go. And I have had the pleasure of working in the field for 28 years and working with many different, at least 4 different municipal law firms in the duties that I had, and there's some really good ones out there. And legal advice before a problem instead of after, way, way, way cheaper. Just my thoughts on the issue. So I already talked to you about your questions. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite thing, which is relationships. But in this case, relationships is referring to bylaws, policies, and procedures. And I did that. And I'm going to move to the next slide. Okay, so what are we covering? Our outline is this. We're going to talk about bylaws, then policies, then procedures. We're going to talk about some of the ways that they're different and how the fact that absolutely is everything is black and white and nothing is gray at all. And I have swamp land for sale in case if you are inquiring about that. So we're going to talk about bylaws as being the authority to create, where your authority comes from to create those. Some tips on drafting and some best practices. And in some cases, we may talk about that R&D term, which in this case means ripping off and duplicating. That comes with its own set of perils. We'll talk about that as well. We'll review some policies, how they're different than bylaws, and the benefit and value that they provide. Like any thing else, the right tool for the job is the way to go with things, and not using a tool that's too big, too small, too complicated, too simple. So we're going to talk into procedures and best practices for those, and then maybe we'll have time to deal with some questions, but we do have some resources that we will provide to you. So the relationship, let's talk about that relationship. Bylaws, they're governing rules, they regulate people and things. Policies provide what a municipality will or will not do. And procedures is the how part of it. How will the policies be implemented? How will they be carried out? Okay, so a bylaw, first of all, is a law made by a local authority as granted, the authority of which is granted to municipalities under our friend, the Municipal Government Act, the MGA, the ever lovable MGA, which is our main legislative piece, not the only one, of course, but the main one. And it's the main source of bylaw authority, but not the only one. Thing about bylaws is that they can be enforced through the justice system. They can include penalties. They can be challenged in court, and they must apply with provincial and federal statutes as well as the Constitution. Some bylaws include some common bylaws, I should say, might be like procedural bylaws, animal control, traffic, code of conduct, of course, your tax bylaw. So some of these are required bylaws. You're required to have a code of conduct bylaw. Other things are discretionary. Procedural bylaw, it's actually discretionary. Almost every municipality has one, but it's actually discretionary. Some don't. Policies are a more interesting beast. If you look in the MGA, what it has to say about policies, it says very little. It says you have to have a public participation policy, and that the planning and development related policies and all the documents, their relationship and the summary of them have to appear on your website. And that's about all the MGA says about a policy. So what is a policy? It's kind of whatever you make it to be. We're going to talk about that though a little bit there, because I have some interesting ideas or thoughts for you. And for my ever favorite thing, my very favorite thing was the policy. The whole thing just goes meta, but the policy, when I was a ledge services clerk, ledge services person, I was fortunate to work in municipalities that had what I'll call a policy, the policy about how policies work and how they'll be structured and what they will have in them and what they won't have in them. And that is a very valuable tool in helping you make policies consistent. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more too. So policies are not a regulatory thing. It sets out what restricts a municipality, for instance, or what restricts the staff, but it's not enforceable like a bylaw is. If you need to enforce it, you need a bylaw. Policies help set standards and help make sure that things are consistent. And it's a really good tool. This really helps councils too, because they will deal with many circumstances that are very similar over and over again. And if they have policies established, then that can streamline a lot of processes. Some things may not even need to go to council because there's an established policy. Now, councils will occasionally look at the policies and change the policies, and that's their prerogative. Of course, that's something they can do. So let's see, what else is interesting here? Some municipalities differentiate between the kinds of policies that council pass and the kinds of policies that administration can set. Now, of course, the fact that this is not legislated, policies are not legislated, leaves the door open for municipalities to set this up as they, for what works for them. So, for example, your CAO bylaw, which you must have, which if you don't have, you should have, because you're required to have it, could say, for example, that one of the duties of the CAO will be to develop the policies and pass policies for human resource matters, for internal staff matters, but everything else goes to council or whatever. Most of the municipalities I work with, all the policies went to council. It's not necessarily the only way it can be set up. You could set it up in such a way so that a bylaw or a policy allows policies to be set internally by the CAO, a designated officer, or whomever. Okay. So as I was saying, the key difference between a policy and a bylaw is enforcement. Municipal bylaws are considered a law. They're a law of the land, and they can be enforced with penalties and such. And I already said that, so I'm not going to say it again. So now procedures are more the how-to. So your policy is this: we will do this, we will not do that, we will allot 20 of these per year, we will whatever. Okay, now you have a procedure that says, hey, you staff person over there, these are the steps to carry this out to fulfill this policy. Okay, or sometimes you'll have a policy within a bylaw, which in a lot of ways, a bylaw could be considered to be a series of policies to some degree, especially the land use bylaw, but I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. My point is this, is that the procedure is the how-to. It points to a policy, a bylaw, or a series of policies and bylaws and says, hey, you staff people, this is how you're supposed to carry this out. This is what needs to be done. Now, you can't change the rules using a procedure. And while that might seem obvious, do think about this, because I have seen where council says this policy and administration says this procedure, and things in this procedure are not consistent with what's in the policy. So you got to make sure those things are consistent with each other. The procedure shouldn't and doesn't trump the policy which has been passed by council. Okay, let's talk about jurisdiction and authority. So section 7 and 8, if you haven't read section 7 and 8 of the Municipal Government Act, possibly the sections after that as well, it talks a little bit about the bylaw passing authority. Section 7 in particular, you'll notice a recently added sidebar, but I think it's worth mentioning. There was a recent change that was made where 7.1 was added that limited municipalities' powers to pass bylaws pertaining to masking and vaccination requirements by bylaw. And basically what it says there is you have to get approval from the province before you pass one of those. Other than that, it's pretty broad. Municipalities' authority to pass bylaws is deliberately and has been set that way to give municipalities the greatest degree of autonomy and authority on their own. Having said that, councils are expected to act in good faith and in the public interest. So section 8 talk about the powers that you can do with bylaws, such as regulating things, dealing with development, providing for licensing. A lot of times bylaws can be tied to fees, they can be tied to fines, they can be tied to many things. It's important that when you're making bylaws, that they are understandable, enforceable, and accomplish council stated goals. You don't want a bylaw in place that goes in a different direction than what council is looking to go. Okay. The interpretation of bylaws is using the what's referred to as the modern method of interpretation. So I'm just reading this off because I can't memorize this. Stated by the Supreme Court of Canada in Rizzo and Rizzo Shoes Limited, 1998, versus the estate of Rizzo and the Ministry of Labor in the province of Ontario. How we get all those people involved in the same legal proceeding, I have no idea. But there's shoes in there. There's the province of Ontario in there, and somebody named Rizzo who apparently has really nice shoes. The words of an enactment are meant to be read in their entire context and their grammatical and ordinary sense, harmoniously with the scheme or organization and ordinary sense, I already said that, and of an enactment, the object, purpose of the enactment, and the intention of the legislative body. What were they trying to achieve? So this is kind of, you have to read the words, but you have to read them in a context. What's the context of how this word is used? Not just literally what is the word, but what is the context in which that word is used? What's around it? What surrounds it? Okay, another thing to mention here about resolutions and bylaws is section 180, and it's really 180 and 181. This is the sections that talk about how council may only act by resolution or bylaw passed at a duly constituted regular or special meeting of council or committee meeting. Okay. It also says that where something may be done by bylaw, where the act prescribes that something has to be done by bylaw, it has to be done by bylaw. If it doesn't say, it can be done by bylaw or resolution. Okay. Anything you can do by resolution, you can do by bylaw, but not the other way around. If something's required to be a bylaw, it has to be a bylaw. Okay. And it also means you can't pass resolutions to change bylaws. You can only pass bylaws to change, repeal, replace other bylaws. Okay. Each bylaw has to have, so this is section 187, must have 3 distinct readings. You can't throw it into all one run along motion. I've seen that before. That's a no-no. 3 distinct readings. And if you're giving them all at the same meeting, you have to have that intervening motion to proceed with third reading at the same meeting. And that motion has to be, that resolution has to be carried unanimously. Otherwise, you can't give it third reading at that meeting. That is how that's intended to go. So sometimes I used to say sort of that there was almost like there was four readings, is not really, but if first, second motion to unanimously agree to go to third, pass unanimously, it has to be passed unanimously. The word unanimously in the motion is meaningless. It's whether or not the motion to proceed to third itself is unanimous. That's the key thing. And then the third reading, which doesn't have to be passed unanimously. And I've actually seen that. Somebody didn't agree with the bylaw, but they did want it to be over with. So they said, okay, I'm going to vote against first. I'm going to vote against second. I will agree unanimously with everybody else to go to third reading, but then I'm going to vote against third reading. And that's fine. Okay. Proposed, we just talked about that. So this is a really important thing, and I get asked this quite often in different forms. Prior to first reading and prior to third reading, all councillors must be given the opportunity to review the full text of the proposed bylaw. This means any amendments to the text of a proposed bylaw must be made after first reading and prior to third reading. That's why they have that thing where by the time you get to third reading, you have to have all your amendments tied up in a nice little bow and put into that bylaw. So that's really important. Now, which side of second reading can you make amendments on? Doesn't matter. What it says in the act is it has to be after first reading and prior to third reading. Okay. Now, can you make changes to a bylaw before you give it first reading? You can, but then don't forget, prior to first reading, all councilors must be given the opportunity to review the full text. So my suggestion is you present a bylaw to council. They have changes that they want to give it even before they give it first. Have them defer it back to administration for those changes. Bring it back for first reading. Up to that point, it hasn't been given first reading. Okay, that's to me a preferable way of doing it. It's a lot cleaner that way. Now, when does a bylaw come into effect? Once it's received its 3 readings and it's been signed, unless the bylaw says it comes in at some future period of time. Note that you cannot backdate a bylaw. You cannot have it come into play. You cannot have it come into effect retroactively. Okay, you can have it come into effect at a future time, or you can even have certain provisions come into effect at a certain time, transitional provisions. But you can't have it backdated. Can't do that. Are we still in the same? Yeah, we're still on that same slide. Okay, this is the longest slide, I think. There's also 2 sections in the act that we get asked about, sections 63 and 69. So both of those sections allow for the consolidation of bylaws, but they're for different reasons and they get there a different way. Okay, section 69 is an authorization bylaw to allow a designated officer to consolidate text already approved by council and passed as a bylaw. So, for example, you have a land use bylaw, you have all these amendments that happen in between doing the major overhaul of the bylaw. So maybe you have 5, 10, 20, or 50 changes before in between the major passings of the land use bylaw. Every now and then you hit the reset button, you incorporate everything, you throw it, okay? What you can do is pass a bylaw that says the CAO or some other designated officer, if you passed a designated officer bylaw under section 210, you have somebody designated, but let's go with the CAO for this one. The CAO may consolidate the land use bylaw and amendments thereto. So that means that the CAO in this case would be able to come up with a version, a consolidated version of the land use bylaw that has all the amendments worked into it. Here you go, here is the consolidated land use bylaw. You're still going to have existing in your files, the land use bylaw and then the physical amending bylaws that have been signed, etc. But that's what that gives us, the authority to consolidate. Now, section 63 is a different creature, and I've seen some people try to fit some square pegs into some round holes here. Okay, section 63 is for house cleaning, not house building. I'm just looking at the time because I don't want to run over my time. Holy crap, how did it be that time already? Pardon me. I will try to hurry along here a little bit. Section 63 is about house cleaning, not house building. This section allows for a bylaw to be revised to fix things like typos or to combine 2 or more bylaws without materially changing them. It's not for making material changes to the bylaw. And then as I say, when in doubt, punt, meaning ask your legal counsel before using section 63. And even if you use section 63, you need a bylaw for that. It requires 3 readings. 63 is to avoid the requirement to advertise, etc., in order to correct a mistake in a bylaw, not to change it. So it can't be materially changing it. That's really important. And if you're not sure whether it's materially changing it or not, ask your legal counsel. If you fail to follow these processes, somebody could challenge the bylaw, and the courts might tell you the error of your ways the hard way. So some drafting basics. Generally begins with identifying the goals of the bylaw. What is the council trying to achieve and why? How does it link to the municipality's strategic plan? If establishing a service or service levels, what is the level of service you're trying to achieve? Is it achievable? And importantly, and this is the broken record part, is it enforceable? some of that other stuff will be more what Tammy might mention a little bit about that, but the point here is don't make a bylaw that you can't or don't intend to enforce. And this is not so much telling it to administration, I guess, than it is cautioning council a little bit. Sometimes if they pass bylaws that have enforcement components, do they have the resources to do the enforcement? Is your enforcement going to be proactive or reactive? A lot of enforcement is strictly reactive. These are all questions that council has to decide because it's part of a service level question. So bylaws should be easy to read, clear and concise. Make sure you define terms when you're required to define terms. Don't go overboard with it either. You're trying to achieve Goldilocks here. Not too many definitions, not too few. You know, you could do things like making sure that your definitions match with what's in the Municipal Government Act. You can even say that a certain word shall have the same meaning as in section 1, I think it is, of the Municipal Government Act, depending on what the term is. It may not be there, but anyway. Be aware of definitions in the Interpretations Act or other legislation. So Santa is giving you a copy of the Interpretation Act. You can access it for free through King's Printer. And if you are not familiar with the Interpretation Act, you may want to read it. There are some sections in there that talk about defining words, about interpreting timelines. There's lots of good stuff in there, and you're subject to them and may not even realize it. So Interpretations Act, it's not too long. I won't say it's an exciting read. The ending was kind of predictable, but it's still a good read. And I recommend you read it. And what else was I going to say? Oh, yes. And the default for the definition of a word is the Oxford English Dictionary, just so you know. Okay, headings should help organize a bylaw. So you've got, you might have a bylaw of the Village of Townsville or City of Townsville for the purpose of controlling animals, controlling reindeers. Let's be seasonal. For the purpose of controlling reindeers in there, and whereas some guy in a big red fluffy suit comes once a year, and whereas he needs these reindeers to do that, whereas reindeers are known to be a little bit of a nuisance and tend to cause issues on property, whereas council deems it necessary for reindeers to only be present once a year. Now, therefore, okay, all that preamble or preamble, as I call it, okay, that sets out context, but it's not the operative section of the bylaw. So it's important that the things you're saying, this is what the bylaw is bylawing, okay, these are the things that are being regulated, is in the operational sections, after the now, therefore, we enact as follows, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, okay, and do use numbering, okay, of some sort. Don't put a button. I've seen bylaws with no numbering for all their clauses in it, including their Santa Claus. Like, don't do that. Make sure that there's numbers. Okay. All right. Lots of resources for bylaws. We have a guide on it. We're going to tell you about that guide. All right. So if you're going to get bylaws from another municipality, what I don't recommend you doing is taking the bylaw, doing a control find of their names, sticking your name in it, shoving it in an agenda package and having council pass it. Bad, 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 bad. Go through the entire bylaw. I don't care how long it is. In fact, the longer it is, the more you should go through it because somebody else is probably not going to go through it. And make sure that that's relevant and it's actually what you want. And don't forget, if you're copying somebody else's work, you're also copying their errors. And we have seen this from my time with the Municipal Accountability Program team, where we went around and we did these little mini audits, these map audits. I can tell you there's a lot of people sharing a lot of bylaws and all the errors and mistakes and things that are contrary to legislation get propagated from one bylaw to the other to the other. Getting bylaws from other municipalities is good for getting you ideas. Cherry pick from them, select from them. Don't think of it as copying, think of it as giving you ideas and providing you possibly with some language and some specific provisions to make sure you don't forget to put in there. But building a bylaw, the best way is not cut and paste, in my opinion. Okay. So this was a slide was written more with the procedural bylaws in mind than anything else. How am I doing for time? 9:32, and I got to wrap this up at 9:45. Okay, wow, no pressure. So things to include: governance structure, definitions, basic rules of meetings, references. You can see them all here. Membership structure, if it's a membership type of a bylaw, what constitutes a quorum, voting procedures. There's also some definitions in the act about quorum, so just don't contradict those. Ad hoc committees, we can talk about that in a minute. And leave out stuff that's frequently changing. Otherwise, you're going to have to frequently change your bylaw, or your bylaw will be offside at some point. Okay. You need to ensure that bylaws include who does the bylaw apply to, or what issue does it apply to? What is the bylaw's purpose? You can put it in the preamble. It does provide help with context. But as I mentioned, and I just can't say this enough because I've seen this, the preamble in a sense doesn't count, in the sense that at the end of the day, what you're going to be enforcing are operative clauses, not preamble. Okay. Are there exceptions? And I hit this the other day too. Somebody said, geez, you know, we're getting noise complaints about our own staff doing work, but we kind of have to do that work. Well, your noise bylaw, does it exclude municipal staff or contractors are working for the municipality? Oh, no, it doesn't. Well, you might want to change that. So think about it. Are there exceptions? Make sure you build those exceptions in if certain parties are not subject to a bylaw or whatever. What are the actual rules? Make sure the rules themselves are actually quite clear. Of course, it always seems like it's clear, and then reality hits and you find out that you may have to go back and you may have to tweak it. You may have to go back to council and say, look, we've come across this one ambiguous situation. We're not sure what the intent is. You guys are the rule setter. What do you guys want? What's your intent? Okay. So make sure to give a new bylaw. No recycling bylaw numbers. They don't recycle. They don't have that little symbol on them. You can't recycle them. Make sure they have a severability clause. You guys know that little clause that's at the end that says, if something in here is deemed to be kaput because of you know, the court of competent jurisdiction said this is, then the remainder of this bylaw shall remain. So make sure you have a severability clause in there. It's a good idea to include the date of the meetings, of the readings, when the meetings, when the readings were done. You may, and then make sure you have signature lines and make sure they actually get signed. Do you know how many times I've seen original bylaws not signed? I don't even want to think about that. Which other bylaws need a public hearing advertised like a land use bylaw? I'm glad you asked that question, Heidi. I'm going to answer it right now because it's a really quick answer. Whichever provisions in the act say they do, but you have to be careful. Okay. Some of them will say this, and that, and then a later clause will say, oh, by the way, you do a bylaw under this, you need to advertise. And then as soon as they say advertise, they might say advertise pursuant to section 606, or it might just say advertise. Generally speaking, it's meaning pursuant to section 606, unless you've done a bylaw under 606.1. We can certainly talk about that in more detail. There's many bylaws that don't need advertising, but some that do, because there's petitioning rights in some cases. And sometimes that's what the advertising is all about. So try not to include sunset clauses unless you're really, really sure. If you're going to put a sunset clause that the bylaw expires at a certain time or becomes inoperative at a certain time, then you need to flag that to make sure that people realize that that's what's happening. You can always change it. You can always amend it. Don't put a provision in your tax bylaw to rescind last year's tax bylaw. How are you going to enforce outstanding taxes from the previous year if your bylaw has been rescinded? Don't rescind your tax bylaws. I've seen that. And my favorite topic, section 145, I'm going to give you homework. Please reread the recently rewritten, but not changed in the sense of what it means. I'll explain that in a second. Section 145. Section 145 is a section about creating committees. All committees, any committees of council, any committees made by council must be made by a bylaw. What about a task force? That's a committee, need a bylaw. But it's just a little ad hoc committee, doesn't matter, needs a bylaw. Anything, well, it's just kind of a little, doesn't matter, needs a bylaw. Really, really, really actually does. So, off to policies. I'm gonna do time. Okay, 7 minutes. So what are policies and how are they different from bylaws? We talked a little bit about this already. Unlike bylaws, policies have no enforcement mechanism. Okay, you can't charge somebody for violating a property. That said, councils and administrators can and should be expected to follow adopted policies. Council can pass or adopt policies by resolution, and that means they can also change them by resolution. If they do them by bylaw, which they can, because remember, anything you can do by resolution, you can do by bylaw. But if they want to change it, they have to change it the same way. They have to change it by bylaw. You can have council administrative policies as well. So like I say, some municipalities set up so that all bylaws are passed by council. Some of them set up that certain ones are passed by administration. Make sure it's clear. If you have a policy that spells this out, that's even cooler. What's a policy? It's a policy that says such things. Okay, policy that says policies will look like this. Policies will have this function, will have a certain structure, will come up for renewal, things like this. There's a lot of good policies out there. Again, if you're going to borrow, just borrow some from other municipalities, learn from them, and come up with your own. At the end of the day, policies, that a policy should be, if there's going to be one, that should be one that's passed by council if council wants it. I think it's a good idea. Okay, some municipalities doesn't make sense to do that. Maybe you only have half a dozen policies, that doesn't make sense. But if you got 40 policies, probably not a bad idea to have a policy. Okay. All right. Benefits of policies. It brings a consistent approach. It's efficient. Every time we get this, we have a policy that says we do that with it. Off we go. It doesn't have to go back to council. Doesn't have to go through any big process. It's in the policy. This is what we follow. Okay. How many policies should you have? Exactly as many as what you should have. It's highly different for different municipalities, and it's up to council. Council may want a throng of policies and have only the very bare minimum things come to their attention, things that are beyond it. Some other councils might say, no, we'll put out a couple of policies for some of the main things. The rest of the stuff, we want to have it come see us. We want to make decisions on it. It's entirely up to council. Policies provide a unified stand on an issue. They can also dictate when exceptions will be made or how and whom, by whom. It helps councillors, because then councillors know what the expectation is too. So I'm a member of council. I have access to all the policies. Most likely I've been given to some online access to it of some sort. And I can see what the policies of the municipality are, so that when somebody in the street asks me about it, I can look it up, or I can tell them, I'll get back to them, I'll go home, I'll look it up on my computer, and I'll say, hey, you know that thing we talked about? We actually do have a policy on it. Here's what it is. It's a really good idea. when you're doing your orientation with council to go over at least all the big ones, all the ones they may commonly be asked about. Routine items can be dealt with by policy, so it's a good idea. When you're doing your reports to council on items, gives you something to refer to. So here's an item, here's some recommendations. Note that this is affected by policy such and such. Therefore, in our options, we have taken that into consideration. You know, quite often in a request for decision form, there'll be a spot on there for referencing any policies or bylaws that apply for that particular item. That's a good idea. And okay, go to the next slide. Policy statement is the what. So good idea to have in a policy is a policy statement. What is this policy about? And what's the overarching philosophy about the item? So the first part is philosophy, okay? So what's the overall statement? Then there's parameters. Who needs to follow it? What are the parameters? When does it apply? Major conditions or restrictions. So reasons for the policy, is it legal or regulatory? Describe what the issue is, why it's a problem, or if it's a problem. Okay, drafting is similar to bylaws. Clarity, consistency, and simplicity is the key. Make them your own. R&D is not really good for policies, but again, borrow from your neighbors for ideas and just to look at things and to say, oh, hey, here's something we should probably include. Don't cut and paste. I really, really don't suggest you cut and paste. You may have council members that bring up and say, I want to put this on the agenda, serve notice of motion, whatever your process is. And then they have this item. They said, I've just talked to so-and-so who's a counselor for such and such. Here's their policy. I like this policy. I think we should adopt it too. No, so you have to kind of work with that. And even then, and council says, yeah, administration, we pass a motion to direct you to draft a policy consistent with this. Bring it back for council's approval. So review it, critique it a bit, point out any issues or concerns that might be brought up, things for council to think about. It's their policy at the end of the day when they do finally pass it. Even though some other municipality may have had it and it might be a good policy, it should still be their own. All right. Procedures. Procedures are the step-by-step for carrying the thing out. This requires the CAO approval or the person that the CAO delegates to do them, depending on the size of your municipality and your situation. May or may not be done directly by the CAO. It is a step-by-step process. Quite often, CAO will tap their staff and say, well, what do you see as the procedure for doing this? Can you write a procedure for how to do this, right? We see this with things like safe work procedures and things like this for in terms of the health and safety, that there are written procedures for things. So it's task specific. It lets you know when you get to the finish line what that looks like. And again, it's the expression of the policy. It has to be consistent with the policy. And it must be fluid in the sense that sometimes a policy no longer works, or procedure no longer works, needs to be changed, or that there were unintended consequences that need to be addressed. So stay up to date with them and continue to make sure that staff are aware of any procedural changes. I'm running slightly over time, but I'm almost done. So some best practice rules: use consistent fonts, margins, and headings, be clear and concise, write in the third person with an active voice. Careful with your words and how you're defining them or where you're getting those definitions. Try to avoid jargon, but explain, and try to avoid acronyms. Explain your acronyms if you're going to use them. We already talked about that. Understand that when the courts read bylaws or policies, a court is going to assume that there's a reason why the bylaw is drafted as it is. that the drafter is competent and has followed drafting conventions. The drafter has relied upon the Interpretation Act. So you really got to know the Interpretation Act if you don't know it. Existing law and court cases have been considered as part of the drafting process. So every word has a meaning. So they're making this assumption. Every word has a meaning and it's there for a reason. So why is it there? So one of the examples we can give you is minimum tax. The Municipal Government Act, Section 357(1) says a municipality may have a minimum tax. One, whatever that minimum tax is. Okay? Wording is deliberate. Okay? If the same word is used in different places, the word should have the same meaning in those places. If it's going to be different, you need to explain that. Okay, I've got, and you will have in your slides, some information on resource information here. And the one that I'll really point you to is the first one, the Municipal Resource Handbook, Basic Principles of Bylaws. You can always give us a buzz at 427-2225. That number again, 780-427-2225. Ask to speak to an advisor. And we've got the professional organizations and the political organizations. Again, we talked about your neighbors with a caveat. And of course, your legal advisors who have paid me absolutely nothing just to say that. I am going to leave things at this point in the very capable hands of my colleague, Tammy, as the rest here pertains to bylaw enforcement. I'm just going to let her go. So thank you for taking over, Tammy.
No problem. Let me just switch screens here a little bit here because we may come back to some of this in more detail if people have questions. Let's see here. All right. Can everybody see that screen okay? Oh, I think I made a mistake. Hold on. There we go. Can everybody see the screen that says Peace Officer Program? All right. So what I'm going to talk about is one specific type of enforcement tool that a municipality can have at their disposal. It tags on nicely to things like the discussion around bylaws, because this is a group of people that, in addition to enforcing provincial statutes and some federal statutes, can also enforce your bylaws within your community. And we'll talk a little bit about, what the differences are between a bylaw officer and a peace officer, but we'll also talk about what's the difference between them and a police officer, because how you make decisions about what program works best for you or what combination of programs really is going to come down to what are they able to do, what responsibilities do they have in terms of their roles and functions. So let me start with the basics here. Okay, so peace officers are designated, both the agency, which is the municipal employer, and the individuals with status, but it's specific to a job function and it's done through provincial legislation under the Peace Officer Act. Where things become interesting here is while the Act establishes standards, transparency, accountability for the peace officers in the province, direct oversight and management of their daily activities, what their focus is, how they relate within the community, all falls to the employer, which is the municipality. Now, there are some employers beyond the municipalities. There are quasi-government agencies, Alberta Health Services, the universities. There's government extensions of government like AMVIC and some of those groups that are all peace officer status, AGLC. And then there are internal government of Alberta peace officers. The most common one you'll know is probably the sheriffs or fish and wildlife or conservation officers. But basically almost every ministry in government does have peace officers. The functions within government, other than those direct and frontline enforcement roles that I mentioned, has a lot to do with investigation work, fraud, identity theft, a number of other things. For example, the Alberta Securities Commission, very complex set of duties and responsibilities, and their peace officer status allows them to undertake some of those duties. They also work directly with the police on those functions because there are elements that go beyond what they can do locally in terms of those responsibilities. So, section 7.5 is what sets out what an individual can do. Section 5 actually deals with what the agency or the authorized employer is responsible for. The key thing is, how do we decide what should go on an appointment? What authority does a person have as a peace officer? Well, all of that is based on what are the needs in the community? What does the community actually need to focus on? Where are the priorities? For example, if you have issues with high speed, whether it's in school zones, on the highways and transportation links through your municipality, all of that falls under provincial legislation. And while you can do some things with bylaw, you can't necessarily do everything. So by being able to give them the authority under the Traffic Safety Act, you can even deal with commercial vehicle enforcement matters as they come up as part of that process. So there's a wide range of different things, but it's all based on what is the specific community's needs. And no two communities are alike, I've learned after 15 years. There's similarities for sure, and there's some common areas, and we'll talk about some of those common duties as we go forward here. But the reality is communities are unique. They are about the people, the businesses, the history and culture of that area. And sometimes it means that, how you handle different issues and problems and concerns in the community will look different. It's if the relationship between a community of 200 and a community that has 200,000 is obviously going to look very different in terms of what their enforcement and public safety needs look like. So realistically, peace officer designation for your municipality expands your ability to address your public safety needs in the community. It's pretty straightforward from the broad perspective. As we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about the overarching ideology of what a peace officer's role is, but I'm also going to bring it down to some real specifics around legislative elements, about policy and standard operating procedures. So you can see how the various things tie into how you would set up a peace officer program, or if you have a peace officer program already, some of this might help you assess where your program's at and where you may have some things that you want to tweak with respect to your program. So the primary overriding objective for peace officers and the peace officers program is to preserve and maintain the public peace. Well, that's a really nice statement, and it's a really big, high-level expectation. But what does it actually mean? Well, as I said, it's different in every community. But generally, it's about supporting a quality of environment in the community that makes it a great place to live, work, and raise families. If we could trust that we are all on exactly the same page about everything in our community and how we live and how we interact with our neighbors, we wouldn't need laws. Unfortunately, we're not. So laws and the enforcement personnel that support those laws, their job is to try and, basically keep everybody in a position where we're getting along so that we're all happy and comfortable with the place that we live. It's a big expectation. It's not always an easy one to meet, of course, simply because we all have a different perspective on things. I know Lucian talked about interpretation. Well, interpretation about what is quality of life for your family and your neighborhood will look different for every family. So it's not so simple as being able to say, this is what quality of life looks like, or this is what a community should look like. So peace officers, as a result, they have to be flexible. They have to have really solid communication skills. And their role is not so much about issuing tickets and bringing matters before courts. The role has to do with trying to navigate processes and procedures and mediate and try to help everybody get along to ensure that you're maintaining a certain standard for your community at all times. One of the key things to understand about the Peace Officer program is how all the elements come together. So there's two key parties in a peace officer program. There's the province and our responsibilities and the legislation that oversees peace officers. And then there's the authorized employer or the municipality and their role and responsibilities to their community and their expectations of their peace officers. So the legislation is designed to take both into consideration. So as I mentioned, the Peace Officer Act is the source of the authority necessary for them to do their jobs and deal with offenses under provincial statute, bylaws, and some federal statutes in some cases. So it really is about what can they potentially do and why can they do it? The next step, though, really ties back to the employer. This is about how do they apply that authority in their community? Well, it's based on legislation, it's based on bylaws, it's based on municipal policy. But there's another key element to this, which we often refer to as peace officer program policy, but it's distinctly different than what your policy is for your bylaws. And I think this is an important distinction because people sometimes aren't sure whether to put this through your formal governance processes or to keep it as an internal element. Every community is different, but I'm going to give you a bit of a description about what goes into your policy and procedures manuals for your peace officer programs to help give you a sense of why you need to maintain some flexibility with your policy because things change. And when things change, you want to be able to make sure that you can share with your staff and your peace officers quickly, as well as your citizens, what those actual expectations are now that those changes are in place. So when we talk about policy and procedures, realistically, we're talking more about expectations and standard operating procedures when it comes from the perspective of the peace officer program. So how do they go about doing this job every day? What are the expectations of the elected officials and the citizens in terms of them doing those jobs? What are the expectations legally for the province, for the courts, et cetera? All of that is going into that process, and that includes public complaints policies on how you manage the process of a citizen being upset because a peace officer was rude, or judgmental, or biased, or where even where, for example, if they think the piece of legislation is unfair. Well, but a peace officer doesn't write legislation. They don't not responsible for creating the enforcement elements of legislation, just like they're not for the bylaws. So the reality is we can't blame a peace officer if a citizen doesn't like the actual law that they're trying to enforce. And we need to know those distinctions so that we can move things out of the peace officer program and into the right legislative avenue or complaints process to ensure that the information gets to the decision makers, which is your elected council, or to the provincial elected officials in terms of how people function with their programs. So, it's your policy is an important thing, but how your peace officers react to your policy is also important. There's a common tendency, and this is often applied to police officers as well, where people have a tendency to believe that if there's a law written down on the books, everything is black and white. You enforce it, that's how it has to be. The reality is life has more nuances. And Lucian referred to the language around ordinary sense. We tend to talk about things from the perspective of reasonableness or guidance or direction that's been provided by the courts, guidance from council. It's about, so what it comes down to is we're creating a document here that tries to develop the enforcement strategies for your community, as well as establish how you run your program within your community. We try to stay out of the day-to-day operational needs of your community. We're always here to provide advice and support, but we are not there on the ground dealing with some of these matters. And our job is to exactly that, provide that support. One of the guiding principles of what we do, though, is we like to encourage an escalating approach to violations. So for some things, it may make sense. Like if you're catching a speeder, obviously this is a high public safety risk. We want them to be aware and we want them to change their behavior quickly. Issuing a ticket on the spot makes perfect sense. Other types of legislative needs or bylaw needs may not require quite that directed approach. You may have an escalating approach where you start with verbal warnings, then written warnings, and you move through the process before you get to the highest level of offense management in terms of what you're dealing. It's important to keep that in mind because that goes back to the concept of reasonableness. The only exception to some of this, and the only area where peace officers don't necessarily have as much discretion about how they handle things, is if a judge has made a direction or decision or provided guidance on something. Sometimes everybody gets so excited about their jobs that they see, for example, they'll pull over a commercial vehicle. And oh my gosh, this vehicle has got 15 offenses. Well, you don't issue 15 tickets. The judges tend to frown on that. However, there are mechanisms to issue a ticket for the worst offense or top 2 offenses. and then use the other mechanisms and prevention and provisions in a piece of legislation to try and help move that driver or owner into compliance with the legislation. So, like I said, things are not as black and white as people would like to believe in law enforcement, that is expected of law enforcement. And members of our communities don't understand the nuances of law enforcement. So for you as administrators, you're going to get those calls where, well, they weren't fair. They just showed up and did this, and they'll get all upset and excited about it and everything else. And helping people understand how to work and navigate that system comes from the peace officers themselves. They need to take the time to explain things to citizens. They need to walk them through the processes, the expectations, the opportunities, the different approaches they can take. They need to be able to have that skill more than they need to know how to use a baton or pepper spray. Realistically, their ability to communicate is one of their top skills as they move through it. The peace officers in this province, they're professionals. They take a lot of pride in what they do, and the majority of them have really good, well-honed and developed communication skills as they start, and certainly as they go through their careers. So as I just to summarize this a little bit, we're talking about, what is the peace officer's role? Well, what does the community actually need? And what provincial statutes, bylaws, or other resources like guidelines are necessary to help ensure that those needs can be met? And it's not, like I said, I don't like using the word enforcement, even though that's actually what we're talking about, but it's more about compliance than it is about enforcement. We're trying to help people understand the importance of changing their behavior to ensure that the community and everybody gets along and everything is healthy and happy within your community as you go along. So the other thing is there's a lot of tools out there that don't have anything to do with issuing tickets or going to court. And community peace officers have a range of those tools available to them, including education. And one of the greatest programs that community peace officers can be involved in, that comes from a positive perspective, is they can be school resource officers. So they can be in the schools and help build that understanding and relationship with law enforcement that sometimes there's negative connotations attached to if you use a police officer. But if you're in a jurisdiction with the RCMP, the reality is their resources are pulled pretty tight because they're dealing with large jurisdictions. Your community peace officers may have the time to take on these kinds of tasks and responsibilities. Their role would look the same as when a police officer is doing it. It's about educating kids to help them understand how to be good citizens, how to be safe in their communities, how to show leadership. And the other side of that is, realistically, if a principal is having a problem with an extremely volatile parent, they might be there to back up the principal if they need to in those situations, or at least make sure the call goes to the police to have that support in place. So there's a range of different things that peace officers can do, not just sit in a car and issue a radar ticket for speeding. They can do beat patrols. They can work with your business community on safety initiatives. There are some enhanced federal authorities that they can have for dealing with, for example, theft and mischief offenses under $5,000. Your business community might, the complaint will go in, but maybe they don't see the RCMP member or the police officer for 2 days because they're so busy. Well, your peace officer might be able to come out right away if they have the authority to do that, and try and help build on that relationship to ensure the community feels like they're being heard when they need help and support from your law enforcement contingent in your community. So you've probably noticed in how I've been talking about this, that your public safety needs in your community, they're not just about bylaw officers, they're not just about peace officers or just about police officers. It's about the combination of those resources in your community and how they're pulled together to actually meet the needs for your community. So when we're talking about what a peace officer does, the more common thing that everybody remembers and thinks about is, well, they pulled me over and I got a speeding ticket. Well, that's a reality, unfortunately. And here in Alberta, people love to drive a little fast. But there are a large number of other things that community peace officers do or can do. And some communities take advantage of them and others don't. And they range from animal control, even parking control, because depending on your bylaws, you may not have the authority to actually tow in your bylaw, but you can bring in the peace officer and they can do it under the Traffic Safety Act, for example. We talked about traffic enforcement. There's some limitations on their traffic enforcement, but if you have major highways going through your jurisdiction, the peace officers now have the authority to do traffic enforcement on all of those highways. So you can expand outside of just, your local streets in your community, if that's what your community needs. If you don't want them out on the highway that runs beside the community or through the community, you have the ability to limit what they're doing with respect to that. If you're dealing with impaired driving, there's limitations with respect to community peace officers. They can take immediate action by issuing a 24 or 48-hour roadside suspension. So basically, they get the person out of the vehicle, send them home, and take the vehicle out of operation for that period of time so that they're not immediate danger to people on the roads. If they suspect a high level of impairment because of drugs or alcohol, that's when they need to call in the police, who will administer breath testing, etc. The challenge we faced, especially in our rural communities in Alberta, is the police may be called off on a more urgent matter, like a suicide or a missing child, and they don't have time to come and deal with this particular offense. So the intent is that the peace officer in the moment can deal with the public safety issue, and if the police can come, then they can deal with the larger issue of impairment and the person's ongoing conduct and behavior. So there's options in terms of how they utilize some of this legislation. So they may not be able to do one thing, but they may have an option within the scope of what they do. I talked about education, but basically your community peace officers, they're your community liaisons. They represent you out there. They're the most visible people that people see because they're in a uniform. They wear a hat. They have this ridiculously bulky belt they wear. They have cars that have flashing lights on top of them sometimes and things like that. So, their role is to be an ambassador for your community in terms of what you do. The investigation side, I talked about some of those things. So theft and mischief that includes cooperation from the police service of jurisdiction for us to put that in place, but it can happen. The inspection side of it, that's a routine part of their jobs, often because of their bylaw enforcement authority. So, this is allowing them to say, okay, the bylaw goes this far, or this is a repeat offender under our bylaw, and enforcement through our bylaw has not been working. So let's take it to the next level and apply the provincial statute requirements onto this individual as a form of escalating how we're dealing with the enforcement and compliance issue that we're dealing with. There's things specific to the environment, to the transportation of dangerous goods. There's some authority that can be granted for enforcement on public lands. Often your municipalities will include provincial parks or other public lands related to the province, or you run adjacent to them where there's camper issues and rough behavior and all those kinds of things. There's ways that you could get some of the authority if it's not possible to have a full contingent of conservation officers or fish and wildlife officers in the area. So there's areas where you can get some authority to help out, but it's also, the intent here is also for your peace officers to really build the relationships with those other agencies so that when there's a chronic problem that they're trying to deal with, they can partner with each other and try to expand the number of personnel and the number of opportunities for dealing with those issues. The relationship side for community peace officers is huge. It's not just their neighboring communities peace officers. It's not just the police service of jurisdiction. It is things like your fish and wildlife officers and your conservation officers, your environment inspectors, your occupational health and safety inspectors. All of those people are a critical part of how they go about doing their jobs because, when they have to deal with something that goes beyond the basics that they have authority for, those are the people that they call in to get help and support from in terms of what they do. There is a provision within the legislation that allows for what are called joint forces operations. So for example, if there is a need to run a check stop on a long weekend to look for impaired drivers, for example, or to check registration on vehicles, that can be a joint operation between the peace officers and the police officers, so they can deal with a range of violations. In those cases, like a peace officer can deal with the fact the person's not wearing the seatbelt. They cannot deal with the fact that the inside of the car smells like marijuana. So, by working together, they can accomplish a lot in a short period of time on those operations. The other option that exists is what's called a shared service agreement. These agreements have two functions. One is they can allow for smaller communities to get services say for a few hours a week or during the summer months, so that they have backup for what they need in their community, or they have service in their community that they might otherwise not be able to afford without the support of an existing program. So those are legal agreements that can be put in place between two municipalities or multiple municipalities. The second part of shared service agreements can come down to doing that backup function. So if you're a community that has, say, 3 community peace officers and your neighboring community only has 1, and that person is entitled to a vacation once in a while, we like to see them happy and healthy. So, you know, they can have an agreement with you where one of your officers will do the cover off while that peace officer is on vacation, to try and ensure that there's consistency of delivery of service in their community, and not have gaps in their service delivery as they go. Trespass on public property is the other one that I see commonly on all community peace officer appointments, simply because all of your municipal properties, including your recreation centers, all of them have issues and challenges from time to time with respect to your population. And it could be the teenagers getting rowdy and hanging around. It could be graffiti that's going on the walls. You could have homelessness in your community, and they're staying on the municipal properties in terms of what they're doing to have shelter. Trespass on public property can help you with some of those scenarios when you've tried all other options and nothing else is working to try and address the issue. Trespass can be complicated in this day and age, particularly with respect to homelessness. I think we all know that this is not something we have an easy solution for yet in terms of how we do things. So, you know, in terms of, this is just a small sampling. There's well over 100 pieces of provincial legislation. I would say 75% of them have the ability for us to designate authority to a community peace officer to undertake those roles. Sometimes the legislation applies to part of their job. Sometimes they have options within the full piece of legislation. And legislation will also dictate, like, what is an offense? You know, and then there's other legislation to support that talks about, okay, what's an appropriate fine for this offense if it's not stipulated in bylaws or if it's related to a provincial statute. So the legal knowledge they have to have here is they need to know and understand all the pieces of legislation that they are responsible for and the guidelines or policy that supports that legislation, just like they would need to know your bylaws, the policy and procedures related to your bylaws to be effective in doing their jobs. It is a lot of information for them to take on, if you think about it, which is why when I see a request from a municipality and it's a really long list of statutes, we tend to have a conversation to try and narrow it down to specific needs, because especially if you're a jurisdiction with just 1 or 2 peace officers, they can't possibly enforce everything on a regular and consistent basis. And being consistent about your enforcement practice, whether it's to issue warnings or to issue tickets or whatever, is really important, because that's how the public perceives how well you're doing your job as a peace officer. So it is critical to try and have some consistency in how you approach things. Now, mayor and council cannot direct their peace officers. So they are not the employer here. The municipal government, the municipality, the entity is the employer, which means the CAO or municipal manager is their employer. In some cases, it's been handed off under the police service, or they may direct the next level down where, like, the fire chief manages something. Larger municipalities have dedicated peace officer program teams that go all the way up to the director or executive director level. So it's, you know, that doesn't mean that council and your administrative team cannot, it doesn't mean that they have no say in what is happening with respect to enforcement and compliance in the community. It's important to remember, though, that discretionary element that a peace officer has in their toolkit is critical. And they are the ones on the street in the moment dealing with the situation, and they have to be able to make decisions based on what's happening in front of them, not, well, we'd kind of like not to do this. Now, a good example of where the discretionary factor and guidance can come into place and be really critical. If you're a rural community with a lot of farmers, during planting and harvest, a lot of extra vehicles are on the roads. They're carrying hay bales back and forth. They're slow moving. technically a vehicle moving that slow is a violation under the Traffic Safety Act. We obviously don't want to go around ticketing all of our farmers for driving slow. That's not going to make any sense to anybody. So the guidance that goes in the policy and procedures manual for your peace officer is that situational awareness component of when is it appropriate to do it. Now, that doesn't mean your peace officer wouldn't, for example, stop the tractor or the truck that's towing the trailer of hay and the hay bales are falling off the back of the trailer. But do they need to give that farmer a ticket for that offense? Or do they help them put the bales back on, secure it, let them go? If it happens again, maybe then they start worrying about tickets and stuff. But that's where your community relations, community liaison role starts to come in for your peace officers. But that's where discretion comes in. Council and administration can say, we really want to avoid ticketing these people because it's a stressful time for them. They've got a lot on their plate. It's just what's required to do their job. And the peace officers are going to go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And like I said, under a reasonable scenario, they'll just wave at them and drive on by. Or they'll stop, help them, give them a bit of a warning to remind them about public safety if things are not secured on their load, and let them go. And then if they keep seeing the problem happening again and again, well, then they may feel they have to escalate because the public safety side of things is not being addressed by the offender. So there's intricacies to how they do their job, and certainly guidance can come from council and administration on how they do that job. But you need to keep in mind that these are sworn law enforcement officers who have the authority to do that enforcement. You're not there in the moment. You don't know what that officer is dealing with. So you have to trust their judgment on some of these things when they think it's necessary to escalate. Sometimes easier than others when it comes up to this. Councils, depending on the council, some councils can be more sensitive to this and they like to have a little more control over some of this stuff, so they don't like this portion of the program very much. But it can be very effective if everybody's communicating with each other well on what they're trying to accomplish, the outcomes they're looking for with that guidance. As long as your peace officers have a better understanding of why they're being asked to consider things, it makes it easier for them to make those decisions as they go forward. Let me just check my time. Okay. So, as I said, I'm going to talk about the differences between things. So we've already talked about bylaws. So as you all know, you can have a bylaw that creates bylaw enforcement personnel in your municipality. These individuals have authority to enforce what's in your bylaws. It's all at the local level. They do not have any provincial statute authority and they have no criminal court authority. And there's even questions about should they be, their training level is significantly different. So, it may be legal for them to carry a baton, but should they carry a baton? Are they properly trained to deal with those kinds of scenarios and situations? If they go to an animal call and the guy comes to the door with a shotgun, are they prepared with how to handle that situation and what to do with respect to it? So there's lots of considerations. It's not that bylaw officers are lesser than. We never want to give anybody that impression because bylaw officers can play a really critical role in your community, and in smaller communities in particular, or when it comes to things like business licensing, inspections, and some of those kinds of things, they are the right people to deal with that situation and that piece of bylaw that's required in your community. When you start to see other more significant issues that are moving into the realm of provincial statutes, and that authority is necessary to ensure that you can address the public safety needs of your community effectively, that's when your community peace officers come into play. And community peace officers can deal solely with provincial statute, or they can do provincial and bylaws because you'll give them a bylaw appointment under your bylaw within your municipality. And you'll have either your bylaw officer bylaw or a separate bylaw will allow you to give authority to community peace officers to be in your community to do that. So they have a range of things. The criminal code authority or the federal authority they have is more specific. It's fairly limited because there is a line between what is a peace officer and what is a police officer. And we're conscious of not crossing that line. And a lot of the reasons for that have to do with training, officer safety. CPOs don't usually carry guns. Well, they don't carry guns. They carry shotguns sometimes for dispatching animals only. Whereas a police officer has authority at all levels, whether it's bylaw, provincial, or federal, their appointment as a police officer covers all of that without any other jurisdictional designation to go with it. So, but as most of you probably know, because our resources in policing are drawn thin on a regular basis, they may not be available to do things like bylaw enforcement. So they have to prioritize. They'll deal with the more serious crimes, but now you have other options in terms of how you deal with the more local issues that are less safety oriented for the officer, but very important to the community's safety and standards in terms of how it operates. So, you know, the best solution for any community is to look at it as a combined resource for dealing with public safety in your community. It's not one or the other. It's how do we utilize all of these resources for our needs in our community? And that goes back to the question of what are the needs for your community in terms of who you are. So here's some key things that are, you know, I just went over the fact that they have different roles and functions. So, but working together is important. They're complementary services. Peace officers can be very flexible and they can adapt quickly to changing needs in your community. If there's a provincial statute that exists and suddenly you have a rising need in your community for enforcement under that, and you can't necessarily get a bylaw created quickly, we can probably within a day or two give the authority to the peace officer to do the provincial enforcement side of it while you're trying to figure out your other options in your community. So they can do a lot and they can change their attention. Maybe their regular duties include a lot of traffic enforcement, but you know, first week back to school, maybe all of that focuses on the school zones and everything that's happening. All of that can be built into how their jobs and roles function. And that's why those are decisions that are made at the local level, not by the province. We have standards for conduct, accountability, for training, for uniforms, all of those kinds of things. So nobody has to, you know, if you go from one municipality to another in the province, you should be able to identify a peace officer because they're all going to look exactly the same. Now, they may have different authorities though. So in your home community, you may expect them to be able to do one thing, but in another community, maybe that's not a priority. So it's important to understand that their authority side of things and their roles can be quite different, even though visibly they're all exactly the same. The community peace officers and the police officers in Alberta have an incredibly well-established relationship. They work very good on a day-to-day basis, trying to figure out how to deal with things. And when those regular meetings are happening with your police services about service delivery in your municipality, have the person responsible for your peace officers in the room. Because, you know, if your police officers are not available to do certain traffic enforcement functions because they're shorthanded, maybe your peace officers can step in and help with some of that to try and ensure that your overall needs of your community are being met during a particular period of time or long-term, depending on what the needs of your community look like. As I mentioned, the policies and procedures manuals, treat them more like standard operating procedures rather than the definition of policies that falls under the MGA. It's more about how they do their job operationally and some of the things like what is the process for complaints within your municipality, things like that, then it is, you know, it needs that flexibility. So whether or not you bring it before council for approval is really a local decision in terms of how you handle it. Just keep in mind that things can change, and sometimes having the flexibility to only require the CAO to sign off on it may suit your municipality the best as you go forward with your needs. There is other mandatories that fall under provincial. So if you're doing traffic enforcement in your community, you need to have a traffic safety plan under the Traffic Safety Act. So there's standards that are in place about how that's done, who has to work on it, things like that. Officer safety support. It is a given that if a peace officer is in danger, in need, and calls for help, the police will come. CPOs often back up the police on certain matters as long as the safety risk is reasonable in terms of how they do it. And I already talked about the shared service agreements and the joint forces operations that allow everybody to work together. It's interesting in Alberta, our community peace officer programs, while they may battle each other for resources for staffing, the reality is they work incredibly well together and they share information back and forth, whether it's about their policy and procedures manuals, about, you know, lessons learned about operational practices, lessons learned about court outcomes. They take the time to share this information with each other, and it helps build on the quality and the standards that exist for peace officers in the program. There are two associations primarily that deal with peace officers. One is the Alberta Association of Community Peace Officers. The municipality is the one that is the member, and then they can provide access to training and all kinds of other things for their officers through that organization. And that organization can also help support you when you're looking at, for example, going to the provincial association meetings, and maybe there's an important public safety or law enforcement issue. You know, they can help you have a better understanding of how to present those issues at those scenarios, so that decisions can be made on something that might universally apply to all peace officer programs. So it's you know, there's a lot of things they can do. The other association is the Alberta Municipal Enforcement Association. I find that the agency, any of the municipalities that primarily have bylaw enforcement as their focus, they tend to associate with that group more, but they have a similar role and function. Education is really important within the associations in terms of trying to build the quality of community peace officers and maintain that quality throughout the province in terms of what we do. So the key thing to remember, you know, is it's not one or the other. How do you work with all three of these resources in your community for success? And all of that then ties back to things like Section 555 and 556 of the Municipal Government Act, and how you appoint bylaw officers in your community. All the information that Lucienne provided on how to create a bylaw, well, either you're going to take your bylaw enforcement officer bylaw and expand it to include community peace officers, or do you need a separate bylaw for that? Those are things you have to look at your local level, and all the principles he talked about would apply here. So the only thing that might be different is the policy and procedures manual for your community peace officer program. And again, it's the level of flexibility that you need in order to meet the needs within your community efficiently and effectively on a regular basis. So the final part I'm going to deal with here really quickly, I know a lot of you are already participants in the Peace Officer Program. The Peace Officer Program is voluntary. It's not a mandatory throughout the province. It really depends on the needs of your community as to whether this is a service that will benefit your community. There's no provincial funding for it. This is a municipal-based service in terms of how it functions. But the decision of, do you need a peace officer program? Do you need peace officers? Really comes down to your community and what's going on in your community. And it can change over time, but it is an investment to start up a program. So you don't want to be doing, oh, this is really important this year, and next year, oh, we don't have the money, so we're just going to put all the cars in storage and not have peace officers. You need a continuity with your program in order to be successful and in order to keep costs within a manageable realm and what you're doing. So the identification of need is what are the issues and challenges in the community? Are your current resources meeting those needs? Or are there gaps in the supports, the enforcement, the compliance in the community, where another entity could help fill that gap for you? Things change over time. Communities at one point, you know, may not have needed certain services. Now they've become a huge issue, where all of a sudden you're having all kinds of problems in areas you never had to deal with before. Homelessness is probably one of the more obvious ones that we're dealing with these days. Always include input from your strategic partners. So, you know, what is your police service of jurisdiction thinking? What is your fire services team seeing when they're going out as a first responder, where there's safety issues and things they have to address? You know, is there a community group, a homeowners association, other groups that can contribute to determining what the needs are of the community and where the gaps in your needs are? Again, it's unique to each community. It's not a cookie cutter approach here. There's some real solid commonalities, but really depends on your community and what's going on in your community specifically. What your needs are also determines tools, weapons, and other requirements for your officers. Weapons are the one thing that you have less influence over, simply because we have to deal with officer safety in the field. So batons and OC spray are mandatory for our community peace officers, and they have to recertify every 3 years to ensure that they maintain their ability to handle those devices safely. Officer safety considerations are a big part of your needs assessment, though. You have to look at risk and liability. If what you're having going on in your community is highly volatile and dangerous, police officers are probably the ones who are going to need to deal with it. For example, if you have drug houses, if you have transportation of drugs in your community peace officers cannot effectively deal with enforcement and compliance. You need your police officers to do it. Now, your peace officers can help, though. Where they can help is they are trained observers by the nature of their roles. They can observe, document, pass information on that's critical to the police to deal with every issue in their community. Again, that supports the importance of the relationship between the police and the peace officers so that information is being shared regularly so they can support each other. Most community peace officers are really clear on their boundaries and they won't overstep them. So, occasionally it happens, and then we're dealing with, code of conduct and employer initiated investigations and things where it happens, but they're minimal, to be honest with you. The reality is the biggest area of increase in complaints that we're getting from the public really has a lot more to do with, people misunderstanding their roles and responsibilities and rights as a citizen. And, particularly their rights with respect to their own property. And they're becoming more volatile and they're becoming more challenging to deal with on a regular basis. A lot of that is unfortunately an outcome of the whole COVID situation as it arose. So, there are a lot more confrontations and stuff happening out there with respect to your peace officers. However, that doesn't mean the risk to their safety has changed in all situations, but in some situations it has. Homelessness, dealing with mental health issues. Peace officers do not have specific authority under the Mental Health Act. So, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a good awareness of who are the homeless people, where are their risks. If we don't see them for a couple of days, should we be alerting the police about the person's safety in terms of their well-being? So those are important factors to look at in terms of what you're identifying as risk and liability by having a peace officer program. And again, like I said, strategic partners are important. That includes your elected officials, your chief administrative officer and senior management, as well as your peace officers if you already have them. Get them engaged in the conversation. Have them bring forward and let you know what they're seeing. So one of the key things I've seen when I go to council meetings, sometimes to deliver presentations, often I see the peace officers who are preceded by the police officers giving quarterly reports that are all about statistics and the number of tickets that were issued. Well, that's important information for sure. But realistically, your community peace officer should be delivering information about trends and changes in your community. So if you're seeing a dramatic increase in youth loitering and graffiti, those are the kinds of things they should also be bringing forward to council so that council is aware of some changing things within the context of their community that they may want to address or find a means to address in terms of what they do. So it should never be all about tickets. It should never be all about the money that comes from tickets. It really should be about what does your community need and what information needs to go back to your council and your senior management teams in order to make effective decisions for your community. So, identification and needs, this is something we can help with. If you don't currently have a program and you want to set one up, we can walk you through this process or help you with it. If you have an existing program, but that there's questions coming back in terms of why do we have this program? Is it effective? Is it doing what we want to? Going through the needs assessment process, is a good exercise to ensure that you're still consistent with what you thought you were having peace officers do in your community. It's not a bad thing to do an annual check-in and say, are we in line with what we were hoping? I'm just about done. So here's some benefits. I've talked about a lot of this as we've gone on, but one of the key things that you always want to think about with peace officer services, we don't deal with your operational needs. We don't tell you what your issues are. So the focus is local, and those decisions are being made at a local level in terms of what it is. And then, our role, the government department that I oversee, that's exactly what we do. We're oversight, compliance, we issue paperwork, we document standards. That's the role that we have. But the biggest part we do is this last one, information and support. Never hesitate to call a member of my staff to ask them if you're not sure. We're here for that. So this is my wrap up here, and then we're going to go into the questions quickly. But I have to say thank you to Lackawanna County for this picture and to their director of their training program, Chris Clark, because this beautiful little girl is his daughter. They run a training program for community peace officers up there in consultation and cooperation with our training academy at the ministry. But if anything represented community to me and the relationship between community peace officers and the community, I thought this picture captured it beautifully in terms of who they are. So my contact information is there, as well as the generic email address for our program, which is monitored and responded to constantly. So if you're not sure who to talk to in my office, send me email to peaceofficerinfo@gov.ab.ca, and my staff will help direct you as well in terms of that process. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tammy, for your presentation as well. And at this time, before we say goodbye, is there any last minute questions? And if there are not, or if you need to go or whatever, you can always contact us with the information that we've been provided. We'd be very happy to provide you with some additional information in the way that we can help.
And Lucy, I'll send you a copy of the slide deck. So if people want it, feel free to send it out to them.
Works for me. Yep. Okay, well, seeing none others, I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank Andrew for helping take good care of us, and wish all of you the very best in the holiday season, and be safe out there, and look forward to a good, new, prosperous new year. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yeah. Enjoy your time with your families and friends.